What's up, tacos? This is Jim Harmer. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about the 1 over the focal length rule for shutter speed. This is kind of the general rule that photographers have used for a long time, and it always kind of spurs on new questions. And so those are some of the things that I want to address in today's episode of Photo Taco. Well, the general rule is this. When you are trying to set your shutter speed to make sure that you don't have too much camera shake in your picture, you want your shutter speed to be 1 over the focal length of the lens. So if I have my lens zoomed in to 55 millimeters, for example, my shutter speed should be at least 1 over 55 to get a sharper picture. So that means I could go, 1 over 60 and I would be just fine. I could be 1 over 80, 1 over 1000, and that's fine. But I just don't want to go under 55 millimeters or 1/55th of a second. So I wouldn't want to go to 1/40th of a second, for example. So that's the general rule, but there are a couple problems with the general rule. And the first question is, what does the rule have to do with the crop factor of my camera? And that's actually a question that was asked on the Improved Photography Podcast Facebook group this week. And I woke up at 4 o'clock this morning. I couldn't sleep real well. And I saw that question. I thought, you know what? I'm going to spend the whole day answering that question. And so I had my general take on it the way that I usually answer the question, but I wanted to get the definitive answer. And so what I did is I went out in the backyard and I started doing some tests because I wanted to have, the actual answer to this, not just something that, we make up when we don't have an answer. So what I do to test sharpness is I usually go tape on the back fence, a printed picture that I've taken, and next to it, I'll just print a page of just random text and I'll tape them up next to each other. And that's what I'll focus on and actually shoot. And the reason that I do that to test the sharpness is when I'm zoomed out, I look at the printed picture that I've taken a picture of, and I get kind of a general sense for how sharp the image is. And then when I zoom in, I look at the printed text, and text, it's just perfect for being able to tell the sharpness of something is to zoom in on a page of text and see how crisp those letters are. And if the letters are really crisp, then you have a nice sharp shot. If they're not so crisp, then you don't have a very sharp shot, of course. So I did this, and I took hundreds of pictures. I started at 1/15th of a second, and I tried all different focal lengths, and I took multiple pictures at each focal length because, sometimes you'll get one lucky frame, but you want to know if they're consistently going to be sharp at those settings. So I took that to look at it, switched to 1/20th of a second, and then I, zoomed in all the different zoom ranges, trying different ones to see how that would be. And I did this all with no image stabilization on the lens first. I wanted to see what I could do in those situations. Now, I'm going to be giving you some of these answers here that I got from my test, and so you should know something about the conditions. One, I'm a professional photographer. I think my technique is pretty good for not mashing the shutter button to jostle the camera any more than is necessary, etc. But it was also pretty cold outside, and because it was cold, my hands were kind of stiff and kind of trembling a little bit. And so I think, kind of balances out to pretty average conditions that I was shooting in. And that makes a big difference because if you hand the camera to a non-photographer, they're not going to be able to get to nearly as low of a shutter speed because they can't hold the camera quite as steady, and they typically mash the shutter button, press it hard when the right moment is happening instead of just gently rolling your finger over that shutter button. So first I did the not image stabilized test, and I got some interesting results from doing that. First, the 1 over the focal length is really pretty close for a full frame camera when we're doing this not image stabilized. You'll notice that I say on a full frame camera. On a crop sensor camera, we always have to apply the equivalent focal length to the equation. So if I take a 50 millimeter lens and I'm shooting it on a full frame camera, that's what we call 50 millimeters. And a lot of times on the podcast, on this podcast and our others, we'll be talking about a certain focal length, 70 to 200, for example. And I always get a comment from somebody to say, that's on a full frame camera. You never mentioned what it is on a crop sensor. And there's a reason for that. Photographers just go by the 35 millimeter standard when we're talking about focal length almost all the time. If somebody says 50 millimeters, they really mean 50 millimeters on a full frame camera, unless they say otherwise. And so just when people are generally talking, that's what we mean when we say 50 millimeters. But if I take that same lens that says 50 millimeters on it, and I put it on a crop sensor camera like the Fuji that I'm holding in my hand, or a Canon crop sensor, Nikon crop sensor, it's not going to matter much. That 50 millimeter lens has an equivalent focal length that's actually much longer. It's more zoomed in than the 50 millimeters on a full frame camera because of the actual size of the sensor. You guys know that, I bet. So when we're figuring out this rule, we have to make sure that we're figuring this out the right way. Because let's say I take a 50 millimeter, let's say I'm shooting at 50 millimeters on my crop sensor camera. I need to make sure to apply the crop factor first before I go to the 1 over the focal length rule. So a 50 millimeter camera, if I multiply it times 1.5, which is the general crop factor on most crop sensor cameras, that gives me 75 millimeters. 50 times 1.5 is going to be 75. And so I need a shutter speed that's at least 1 over 75 in order to get a sharp shot as the general rule. So we do need to apply that crop factor first to the rule. Now, if you don't want to do this, I've made a handy dandy little shortcut that you can go to at improvephotography.com/focal length rule. That's improvephotography.com/focal length rule. And basically what I'll have for you there is just a little cheat sheet that will already do this for you. It will already show you what the equivalent focal length is for a lot of the different focal lengths, whether you're on a crop sensor or a full frame camera. So that's at improvephotography.com/focal length rule. Now, what I've done here is I took multiple pictures at each focal length, and then I'm going to tell you, if you're getting poor results there where almost every photo is blurry, fair results where some photos are sharp but most aren't real sharp, and then good and great for each focal length and every different focal length on crop and full sensor cameras and every different shutter speed combination. So it's a pretty handy little worksheet that I've made for you there. I'd definitely check that one out. I think it will help to understand this a little bit quicker. But once you have that, and we understand we need to apply the equivalent focal length to get there, there's more to understand than that. And the first thing to get while we're applying this rule is focal length is a range. It's not like one set thing of sharp, not sharp. I think a lot of photographers kind of think of it that way, if something is sharp or not sharp, but it's really a lot more complicated than that. As I went out and did some of this testing, I took some pictures to kind of highlight this, to show how different things look with that range of sharpness. And on the article that I mentioned at improvephotography.com/focal length rule, I have a picture there that shows, a really sharp sample, a kind of sharp sample, etc. And I think that's an important thing for you to go look at, because it kind of gives you an idea of what you're really needing for the sharpness. Now, it's tempting when you're testing for sharpness to really to be a little bit too picky on the sharpness. We zoom into 100% right into the tiniest little detail of a picture and we say, that's blurry. But really, when you're using the photo how you're usually going to use it, which is, zoomed out, it's really just going to be small on Facebook is where most people are going to see it. Well, that picture might have perfectly decent sharpness. So keep in mind the way that you're actually going to use the photo, and it may change your standard for what actually is sharp in that situation. Sometimes we don't need to get quite as obsessive as sometimes we are. We all want sharp images, but if it's really only going to be shown on Facebook small, it really just isn't that big of a deal. But if you're going to be printing big, you're going to be cropping into the picture, etc., then we really need every tiny little bit of sharpness that lens can give us. So that's the 1 over the focal length rule, and I hope this provides a little bit of supporting information to help you understand it and apply it better, just the rule itself. But you should understand that technology is changing the rule pretty dramatically. A few years ago, we could pretty much walk by this rule and do just fine. But now our lenses have image stabilization. And if you turn on that image stabilization on your lens, then the whole equation changes because we're getting, 3 and 4 stops extra image stabilization just by turning on 3 and 4 stops more sharpness by just turning on that image stabilization. And so it changes the formula. And so I did tests with image stabilization and without. And, you're getting you can go quite a bit slower on the shutter speed, cheat down quite a bit more than we used to be able to if you're shooting with a lens that's image stabilized. Wow. As image stabilized. Or sometimes cameras have it where we'll see the image stabilization on the actual camera. And that's really nice to have because then every lens you put on there is also image stabilized. Anyway, so that's something to be aware of. We can't take this as the gospel truth anymore because image stabilization is changing it, and also our sensors are getting much higher resolution. When I started doing photography professionally, I used a 10 megapixel DSLR. And, that's just what we had. And so the sensor wasn't even capturing that much detail. And so if it was just a tiny bit sharp, there wasn't a lot of detail anyway to blur out. But now we're shooting 36, 24, 40 megapixel files on our DSLRs. And so any tiny little mistake we make in the sharpness, and you notice it, because we can zoom in and see that real fine detail, and we don't want to lose it if we don't have to. So our standards for what is the proper focal length or shutter speed for different focal lengths is constantly changing depending on the technology. But generally, it's that 1 over focal length rule. I hope this episode of Photo Taco was helpful for you. If you want to learn a lot more about the kind of fundamentals of photography, stuff like this, then please check out Photography Start. Photography Start is a class that I put a ton of work into. It's basically, I think it's a little bit over 3 hours of video training, if I remember right. And it just walks you through the fundamentals of photography. It's 22 HD videos where I'm using inexpensive gear, walking you through a lot of photo recipes for how to make stuff. It's priced at $50 right now. You can go get it at improvephotography.com/start. Or you can just go to improvephotography.com. I made a new link there for the store in the menu that you can just click on that and you'll see Photography Start. Thanks for joining me in this episode of Photo Taco, and we will see you in the next one.